Welcome to your Hope-Filled Perspective with Dr. Michelle Bengtson. I am delighted that you have chosen to spend a few minutes of your week with us. If you have ever been the victim of physical or sexual abuse, or been the target of domestic violence, or survived a traumatic event, then this is the episode for you. Scripture tells us in Psalm 9:9, the Lord is a shelter for the oppressed, a refuge in times of trouble. And 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Today we're going to be talking about finding hope and healing after trauma, particularly domestic violence. On today's show, we're going to be talking to my friend Melanie Pickett. Melanie is a mother, a wife, a writer, and trauma survivor. She is currently writing her first nonfiction book and shares her story and encouragement on her blog, melaniepickett.com. Melanie encourages women to show their worth in Christ, shares how to choose wisely in all types of relationships, and inspires hope after painful trauma. Welcome to the program, Melanie. So glad you're here.
Hi, I'm so grateful and happy to be here with you.
So, Melanie, I understand that you are a trauma survivor. For
Yes.
those who don't know you, will you share a little of your story, what happened?
Sure. I was in a 15-year abusive marriage. He, as typically, I think abusive relationships don't start out that way from the get-go. So there were some red flags that I missed along the way, but things, and as also, I think, typically escalated as time went on. It seemed to be as life got more stressful, as it always does, right? He displayed more and more of an inability to cope. And things just escalated from manipulation and lies and verbal abuse on to eventually to physical abuse. And, I felt I was unique. I didn't really understand, I was a smart girl and everything, but didn't really understand what was happening. My parents had both passed away by that time, and that foundation was gone, that security. And I just felt like this was kind of not necessarily my fate. I didn't believe that this is what God wanted for me, but I was trying to protect my children. And so I did stay in the marriage. And one day was been estranged for about a week. That was a manipulation technique that he actually used. Was if I wasn't getting in line just exactly the way he wanted to, he would leave. And he would just typically leave for a couple of hours. And it was all a control thing that he would call or text or whatever medium he would use at the time and threaten me. Not necessarily with violence, but he was going to go drain the bank account, or he was moving away. It might sound silly, or like that would be the answer, let him go. But when you're in that situation and your self-esteem is down and you've been led to believe that, you're not going to be able to survive without him, you beg him back, which I had always done. Up until this last time, I did not do that. And either something changed in him or changed in me. And I just felt I couldn't do that. And so we were estranged for about a week, and he was supposed to actually be out of town for several days. I took my children to school this particular morning, as I always did. And in that 20-minute window, obviously he had come back a little earlier in the morning, but in that 20-minute window that I was gone, he had parked his car down the road, hidden it from my view, and gotten in the house, locked the door. I had no idea he was there until I was well into the house, and had a gun.
Wow.
And he had a gun and some sort of electrical cord. Like I equate it to like those extra computer cords you have laying around. And so
Yeah.
he restrained me, and he very, I say hatefully, sexually assaulted me at gunpoint. So I had no means of escape, obviously. And then felt, there was a really good chance I might be in heaven that day, but I believe God spared me. I mean, I'm here, but my husband took his own life right in front of me. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and I'm here, and I'm grateful for every breath since then. So very traumatic experience in many ways, but and it was 8 years last month that this happened. So
Wow. So how old were your
my
children
children,
when
they
this
were
happened?
9 and 13. And
Oh
to me,
my.
that's babies. When I look back at those Facebook memories that pop up, and I realize just how really young and tender ages they really were at that time.
How did you even go about beginning that healing process? I mean, not only was there the domestic violence, which is horrible, but then the sexual
Right.
violence, and then seeing him kill himself. How did you even begin to pick up any of the pieces?
Right. I always say I got a lot of new hats that day, in an instant, a single mom, a widow,
Yes.
suicide survivor, whatever you call it, a gun violence survivor, all those new titles that nobody ever wants. But, for probably about a week, we were just in shock. I mean, we never stayed another night in our home. Um, that was my grandparents' home that we had bought. So that was an additional grieving thing for my kids and I. This was a home that had been in my
Oh,
family
yeah.
literally since the 1800s. And now had become a place of really of horror for us. But we just had to, we were surrounded by a great church family, and we instantly moved in with my brother and his wife and kids, which we were packed into this, one family home that was also a daycare. So if you can imagine 7 people living in just a regular size home, not a overly large. And I look back at that and think, but that was exactly where we needed to be. My kids are very close to their cousins. I'm close to my brother and his wife. She's a sister to me. And, just those tight quarters it was just 2 months, but it was exactly what we needed, was just to be really surrounded almost every second of the day. And, of course, our church family just instantly were right there. What do you need? They helped us move out of that house. They stored things, sold things, whatever. They would bring stuff out into the yard for me to sort through, so I didn't have to go in the house. We found
Mhm.
excuse me, a rental home. So once we kind of went through those initial steps of finding a new place, that was really when we started to come to terms with reality. All the people have gone away, things have settled, kids are in school, I'm back to work, all those things. And you come to terms with your new reality. And it was not easy. We had good people telling us you need to get into trauma counseling immediately. And I did. All three of us. We lived in a little dinky town, so we didn't have a lot of options, but we found the single Christian duo counseling team in town, and my kids and I went to them, and we just started to find our feet. And I remember getting on my knees. I don't know if they remember, but I do, and in their faces, and I said, this is a really bad thing that has happened to us. It's going to hurt for a long time, maybe always, but this is not an excuse for you not to do well in your life. This is one chapter, and it's a really bad one, but this does
Yeah.
not dictate your whole story. God has better things, and we just have to hang on to that. And it's very hard as a parent when you don't,
I love that.
yeah, you don't have those answers that they're seeking. How could their dad leave them? You know, just all those
Yeah.
questions we won't have answers to on earth. But we just had to.
But what you told your children, I think, is what many of my listeners need to hear, because we all will go through difficult times. Hopefully not as traumatic as what you and your children faced, but what you told them, that this is a chapter, a horrible chapter, but it's not the whole
Yes.
story. It's not the rest of your life. And I think that so many people need to hear that. Instead of staying stuck,
Yes.
be ready to move on. Feel the grief, feel the pain, feel the anger. but know that at some point it's time to move on. Don't let that become the destiny.
Yes.
I think that was sage advice you gave them.
Thank you.
Melanie, as a writer and a speaker, I have found that we typically write or speak from our experiences that have had the greatest impact on our life. How has your experience in your abusive marriage shaped not only who you are as a person, but who you are as a writer or a speaker?
I've always had a love of writing since I was a little girl, but in those dark nights when the kids were asleep and we're in this rental house that we didn't want to be in, it wasn't our big house. I call it that. When I think of that house, I call it, that's the place where we would heal, and God gave us beautiful neighbors
Mm-hmm.
that came alongside us and all that. But in those dark nights when the text stopped and people stopped checking on me, I started to write. And I wrote letters to God. I wrote letters to my former husband. He's not here for me to yell at and say, how could you do this? Why would you do this? So I
Right.
had to write letters. And then I just was reading a lot, and it just kind of cultivated and, grew that love of writing for me again. And it was a couple of years later before I started a blog. And I dabbled on Blog Her. It's now defunct, but I started writing there, and some articles got featured, and that really like boosted my confidence. And then I just realized I had a story to share. I'm an introvert, and if anybody who knew me in high school or as a child, or if my parents were here today and they saw me doing this, they would probably be, Melanie who? They would, because I was just so shy. I couldn't speak in front of more than two friends who were sitting close. I couldn't raise my voice anymore. But God has just enabled me to do that. And not everyone can share their story, and that's fine. But he has allowed me
Yeah.
to do that. And it's just, I've used it in my writing. And, just when I think nobody's listening, I'll get a message from someone saying that this particular blog post or something I wrote on someone else's blog, just really, that was what they needed to hear that day. So we never know. We sometimes think we're just this tiny little speck in this big old blogosphere, but our story matters. What we're saying matters. And, that has just put me in a different position, to be talking to you here today, that
Oh, yeah.
someone needs to hear that. And if it's even just one person, then it's worth that. It's worth it,
It,
to pour your heart out onto a page for all the world to see.
and I think that journaling that you spoke about, that can be so healing,
Yes.
even if nobody ever reads
Mm-hmm.
it. That's dialogue that's essentially between you and the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be healing. When you started talking about your story, you mentioned that there were some red flags that you didn't see at the time. Can you share what any of those were that might help a listener who might be experiencing those same red flags
Sure.
now?
Um, he was actually abused as a child, and he had a rough childhood. And, there's that saying that abusers abuse, but of course that's not true of everyone. Um, it's, I think you kind of choose your path. He didn't get help with it, even though he had a great amount of support. He didn't want to share. He didn't want to talk about it. I can handle it kind of attitude. But even in our dating, I was very naive. I'm an empath, compassionate, and he was a fixer-upper, and that was attractive to me. Like, he didn't have family.
Mm-hmm.
My family can be your family. I can fill that need. I'm very nurturing, and that all those qualities I just mentioned are great qualities, but not to be used in this way. I can't fix
Right.
him. There were just some things in our dating life even that I didn't realize, some lies that he told that were even just small lies, but lies break a trust. But a manipulator is really good at turning that around. So the finger's pointing back at you. You're why I lied, you know?
You're right.
And
Yes.
just those things. And then, I kind of had low self-esteem. I was raised in a great family, but for whatever reason, had that kind of lower self-esteem. And I was just clay in his hands, molding that and setting the groundwork. Um, and we didn't fight well. There was not any physical abuse in the dating, but it was a very immature relationship. I remember having some girlfriends over on our break from college, and this was before cell phones. And he every 20 minutes he was calling my parents' house. I lived with my parents. Call, is she done yet? Is she done yet? You know, he couldn't stand the thought that I was spending time with other people. And that was,
Mm-hmm.
you know, some people misconstrue that for being, oh, he just wants to spend time with you. But that's really being possessive, and, you know,
Yeah,
that's not a good sign. That's not attractive, and it's not a compliment. It's a red flag. And I miss those things.
absolutely. But by you sharing those today, I'm convinced that they will help someone else who might be experiencing some of those
Yeah.
same red flags but doesn't see them for what they are. You know, hindsight's 2020, and there's no
Yep.
shame, there's no guilt, there's no condemnation that you didn't see them, because the qualities that God put in you as a nurturer and an empath are also some of the things that probably kept you from seeing some of
Yes.
those red
Yes.
flags. Listeners, we're going to go to a 1 minute commercial break, but I want you to stick with us and hear Melanie share more of her wisdom and insight and healing from a history of trauma and abuse. You know, Melanie, they say that hindsight is 2020. When you look back on your marriage of 15 years and some of those red flags that you didn't see, what would you say to someone who might be experiencing some of those now?
I would encourage them to really examine their relationship. You know, I've written blog posts. I'm sure there are many blogs, many books that will even give you just a checklist. You know, what is your relationship like? You know, are you happier more than you're sad? Are you fighting fair? I actually teach a class on that now, and at our local women's shelter, which is another like, wow, God, like it was so
Yeah,
excited to do that. And so I'm actually designing that class. But one thing I like to and should have lined it, does it line up with the love chapter in the Bible? Is it love? Is it patient? Is it kind? Is it jealous? Is it boastful? You know, those things are a great guideline for what your relationship is like. Are you afraid in your relationship? Do you feel like you're not supported, or that you can't share your true feelings? You know, there are so many red flags. And trust your gut. You know, our gut instinct is there for a reason. And if you're feeling like this might not be right, it's probably already not right. Or if you're feeling like you're not being treated well, you're right. You know, you're right. And you should examine that before it gets any deeper. I wish they held these kinds of classes in grade school so we would learn those things before we ever start dating. I think it's so
absolutely.
important.
It is. It is. I'm grateful for the work that you're doing at the shelter to help other
Mm-hmm.
women. Is that something that would have helped you, I think, at that time?
Yes, it would have.
In those months and years following the trauma, how did you keep moving forward, and what did you rely on to get up every day?
My kids, you know, God kept me moving forward. And there were days when my feet were like lead, you know, just I had a friend who had
Yeah.
lost a husband in normal circumstances a few years earlier, and she was one friend that didn't just coddle me. I remember going to her house, and she didn't hug me. She was like, and I was just bawling, just in a puddle. And she's like, you need to do this. This is what you need to do. Grief is exhausting, and you need to go through it. And she said something like, you're never more alive than when you're in pain, because you're feeling God is really working. That's when you're like on your knees and you're really like just face to face with God. And she was
Yeah.
right. And there were some dark days where a couple months where I just cried, and I met with friends, and I would sit in McDonald's with them and just cry. But was like a golden period, because I always knew I'm coming out the other side. There's going to be light eventually, and God is working. And, you know, people kept saying, I just keep waiting for you to collapse. And I said, if I can't collapse, I've got two kids, and if I collapse, they're going to collapse. So, you know, they've
Yes.
kept me moving forward. They're, you know, the reason I breathe. And, you know, always that promise I've always clung to, Jeremiah 29:11, that, you know, God
Mm-hmm.
knows, you know, there's a
Yes.
future and a hope. And I literally, that would just go over and over in my head. You know, I never doubted him. I never blamed him. I was never angry. You know, this thing happened, but I'm alive. bottom line, I'm alive, and that's a really good thing. So I knew that
Mm-hmm.
he was going to pull us forward through this, and he really has. Um, and I just always had to keep that in mind. My kids need me, and there's a greater purpose for this.
Our kids can be an amazing motivation
Oh, yes.
sometimes. Given the traumatic experience that you had with your first husband, did that ever keep you from pursuing other romantic relationships?
Well, I am remarried now, very happily, to my kinsman redeemer, is what my therapist called him, and I
Mm-hmm.
like to call him that too. He just loves us. We still struggle sometimes, and he understands, and he lets us be where we are. He's driven my kids to the cemetery to see their dad's headstone. I mean, he's just really amazing. He's everything that we needed and that I've wanted and never thought I'd have. But definitely, dating was terrifying, and I only dated him, and it was still terrifying. I had to. My kids actually encouraged me to start dating. My daughter was like, "Get on Christian Mingle, start looking," and so I did, and that's where I found him. Or that's where God put him, so I could find him. But I made a comprehensive list. I guess I shouldn't say it was about 12 things, so not very long, but 12 things. And I made myself accountable that he had to have these, period. Like there was
Wow.
no excuse. There were no yeah buts, is what I called them. Not like, well, yeah, but he doesn't have the absolutely non-negotiable. And he did have all 12 of those things. And number one was he has
Wow.
to love God and live like it. He couldn't just say it. I had to see it, you know, and it was scary. I remember meeting him for a date. He lived 3 hours away, so I traveled, and that's to that date, and I stayed in a hotel, just FYI, and drove back home. And I remember I cried all 3 of those hours because I knew I liked him, and I was so scared. And I just
Yeah.
had to make sure that this was the way God was guiding me, and that I kept that list, and I did not deviate. No excuses, because it can be scary. But I knew
Ab-
that my first marriage was not what marriage is supposed to be. That there were good marriages out there, and I just had to be sure that that's what I had next time.
and you mentioned Jeremiah 29:11, but I think that this new marriage, this new relationship is an example of how the future that God had for you
Yes.
was a future that was good
Yes.
and filled with hope and promise. So again, God always fulfills his
Yes.
promises, but we have to cling to them. We have to trust him, which can be hard after you've been through such a traumatic
Right.
experience.
Yes.
Did you ever blame God?
I didn't. I blamed my first husband for what he did. I came to a place where I could find a little bit of compassion for him, because I knew that I felt like he had some mental he had to have some mental illness. He was very
Sure.
very much a narcissist and things like that. But he also, excuse me, I found out after he passed away that his mother had a severe mental illness that she had been hospitalized for. So there was um, something in there, and like my brother said, maybe we should just be grateful he lived 40 years, because, and was able to keep it together that long. He didn't
Mhm.
behind closed doors, but, um, you know, I just lost my train of thought. But I
That's
was
okay.
able to find some compassion for him, because I think even though I was angry that he didn't get help all those years, I think that he got to a point where he was just beyond that he was beyond helping himself. And I think that's when these things spiraled. And I have compassion for him for that part of how tormented he must have been. So I hold him
Sure.
responsible, but I've never blamed God. I don't give my first husband credit for sparing my life. Many people think he absolutely intended to take my life that day. So I'm just grateful for God. And I realize that people will argue, well, but he let this happen. He did, but I'm alive and my kids are alive. And what more can I ask for is to be,
Yeah,
have two healthy, happy kids. So, no, I feel like God's always on our side. We just don't know always what's going on, but he's always working.
that's true. That's true. Listeners, we're going to take a real quick 1 minute commercial break, but stick with us to hear Melanie share more of her wisdom and insight about healing from trauma and abuse. Melanie, what message do you want others to hear if they're suffering through an abusive situation or have survived a trauma? How would you encourage them today?
If they're in an abusive situation, I want them to know that there is hope, there is help. I want them to know that this is not their fault. They didn't ask for this, that it's not okay that it's happening. They don't deserve it. If they are in an abusive situation, they need to get help to get out. It's very dangerous when they do leave, which is not a reason to stay, but reach out to an agency, a friend, some way to get help so when you leave, you and your children are safe. Um, and if they've come out of an abusive situation, well, I should note, backtrack, finances are a terrifying thing to leave. But even if you have no pennies to your name, don't let that make you stay, because you don't want that to cost you your life. There, God will figure everything out. Just get to safety.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've come out of that
Right.
kind of situation, same thing. Know that there's hope, that there's healing. You are not damaged goods, that God determined your worth long before we were ever here. We are priceless, and that's true. And I really believe if I had, even though I loved Jesus, I didn't really grasp just how valuable that I am. And if I had, I probably would have said, you can't treat me that way. I'm better than that. And they're better than that, really. But they don't, abusers don't understand that either. But to know your worth in Christ, just to cling to him, because this is going to be a hard journey, but it's going to be really good and you're going to learn from it. And there are so many better days ahead. So to hang in there. And I always encourage people to get biblical therapy. It is amazing. And it has worked wonders for me. And I really think that that is key to healing and moving on.
And I'm glad that you brought up therapy, because there is no shame in
No.
seeking help. And a good therapist can be crucial in terms of helping us with the healing. But what are some other key things that you know now that helped you make wiser choices in relationships going forward?
Now I understand more about myself. I um, know my worth, and I understand all those red flags and that I should be treated better, and just scary red flags of potential abuse and excuse me, and just knowing, that I deserve more than that. And that's why I write about it, because I'm a cautionary tale. Don't want people to be like me. I want them to avoid these relationships or get out of them if they're in them. But looking back, I see the mistakes that I made. Although I don't blame myself, I never felt that I deserved that.
Right.
I always just prayed that God would somehow just change them, and I realized too late that
Mhm.
we have free will, and God's just not going
Yes.
to wave a magic wand and you're right. You need to work yourself. And my first husband needed to make those changes. He needed to avail himself to God and admit that he had a problem. And then once you do that, then you can start to heal and change. But it wasn't going to come from me, wasn't going to come from God. I can't change a person. So if you're going to get in a relationship or marry somebody, you better like everything about them, because they're not going to change unless they decide
That's
to.
right. That's right. I think too often people go into relationships thinking, well, I can change
Mm-hmm.
them. And that's just setting you up for
Yes,
disaster.
I agree.
Disaster. I agree. You better like it, love them, because the things that you don't like when you're dating are the things that are going to irritate the tar out of you
Yes,
later. You're not going to be the one to change them. Only the Holy Spirit can
right.
change them.
Mm-hmm.
If a listener is struggling with domestic violence or is maybe even in a post abuse situation, what hope-filled perspective would you want to offer them?
Excuse me. I wrote down this verse, like, I clung to after everything happened, and it's Deuteronomy 31:6. And I'm just going to read it real quick. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified, for the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you or forsake you. You know, even if you are in the bottom of your life right now, God is right there with you. And I would just say that, again, there is hope, you know, and it's not just an empty, wispy cloud that sounds romantic. Like, there is actual hope in Jesus, and he's not going to leave you where you are. He's right there in the trenches with you. And, you know, good things are going to come from this, and things will turn around from you. It's not always going to be this way. And again, if somebody's in the abusive relationship, to get a safe plan to get out without that person knowing, because that is statistically the most dangerous time of the relationship, is when the woman or the man, you know, when the abused person leaves. So
Yes.
get a plan and get to safety, because that is, you know, we read those stories. They're so prevalent in the news lately, and I don't want anyone else to be a statistic. I don't know how to stop it, but, you know, if I can share that information with one person,
Yes.
you know, maybe we can prevent it.
Well, and by you sharing your story and someone else in a similar situation hears it and gets out to safety, then they can share their
Right.
story to one other person and one other person and one other person. And before you know, we've saved many
Right.
lives. What suggestion do you have for the listener in an abusive relationship that they could begin to implement even today to start making healthy change in their life?
If they're in a dangerous relationship, I would be very careful, but I would try to find a therapist. And I realize that you know, money might factor in, or, you know, sometimes you have to do these things in secret because they will pay for it later. Talk to a
Right.
pastor. I mean, even, you know, a trusted friend, a neighbor. Confide in someone, because this is terribly isolating. And like I said earlier, I felt very unique. I didn't think anyone would understand, and someone will. You know, even if they've never been there, they will understand. Confide in someone, because just losing that loneliness is tremendous, and knowing that someone else understands, and then start putting things into place to get to safety. I know a lot of people as Christians feel like they need to stay in that marriage. And I never say get divorced or don't get divorced, but the important thing is to get to safety. You know, don't
Yes.
don't worry about that later. God is not going to punish you for getting you and your kids to safety. So
Right.
just set all that aside. Finances, there are agencies. Have a friend help you and make a plan, because, you know, even if one thing that is very important is never say, well, at least he's not hitting me. You know, it's just verbal abuse, it's just financial, it's just emotional, whatever. Because it was just that for me for several years too. And it almost cost me my life. You know, you don't know when things are going to turn. And abuse
Right.
is abuse. I
That's
remember
right.
a time or two just begging him just to punch me, because it would hurt less than his words, than his verbal abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is very damaging. So don't feel any comfort in the fact that maybe he's not hitting you, but he's abusing you in every other way.
Yeah.
And,
Thank you for that. Listener, I want to leave you with this. If you are one who is in an abusive relationship or even a post abuse situation, and you're just really wondering, how do I go on? I want to leave you with Psalm 18:2 that says, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold." God does not want this for you. God does not want you in an abusive relationship, and He will get you through. You've got to turn to Him and ask for help, but He promises to be all those things for you. We will have Melanie share more of her story on my blog, which is drmichellebengtson.com. But I pray that what you heard in today's episode and Melanie sharing so vulnerably of her own story will give you hope in your own situation. Until next time, this is Dr. Michelle Bengtson with your hope-filled perspective. May you have a hope-filled week.